So I thought I'd start out by asking, how many of you in the audience are quilters? Do we have any quilters? Great. And for those of you watching later on Facebook, comment below if you're a quilter or quilt enthusiast. We'd love to know more about our audience. Well, one of the things I've learned over the years is that quilters are very curious people, and those of us who love to research quilts, we're also very curious. And we often want to know what the back of the quilt looks like. So the general population, I think overall, might assume that the back of the quilt is the boring side of the quilt, that it's quite plain, maybe doesn't have very much pattern to show. But over the years, I've learned that the backs of quilts are a wealth of information. There's so much history you can learn from the back of the quilt. Sometimes they're very beautiful and surprising. So with this particular exhibit, I wanted to incorporate some aspect of letting people investigate what the back of the quilt is like, and letting people's curiosity lead them towards discovering that. So that drawer unit, which is right over there, has 5 quilts where you can explore the backs of the quilts. So since this is an exhibit about color, I picked a few quilts that have interesting colors. So we've got a bright satin quilt. We've got one quilt that's exactly the same on both sides and is all white. And there's some other interesting quilts in there for you to explore. So since our time is really limited today, I'm going to let you do that after the program, and we're going to focus on the quilts that are hanging in the gallery. We'll get to some of them today, not all of them, but you're welcome to stick around afterwards, and I'm happy to chat about anything that's on display today. So with that, I'm going to start with this one. This log cabin quilt is one of the most colorful in the exhibit, and the backing is actually quite surprising. So I'm going to put on my gloves here and show you. It's the most wonderful blue with kind of a pink tinge depending on the light. So you can see that here. And if you want to come up afterwards, you can get a closer look and get your nose a little closer to this beautiful color. One of the challenges with an exhibit is that preservation is very important for us. A lot of these quilts are so old, they're quite fragile, so we have to be very careful and wear gloves when handling. That protects them from the natural oils on our hands. You'll notice this lining here, it's very regularly quilted, and it was actually a commercial lining. So that's something that quilters could actually buy to add to their quilts. And that was kind of common with crazy quilts in the 1890s, 1880s period. But you'll also notice that in the catalog, they're not just listed as quilt backings. They're called linings, quilted linings. And that's because they were commonly used for lining things like coats and capes. So I brought out a wonderful little jacket from the collection for you all to see today, to see how these quilted linings were also used in clothing. And this is a beautiful red quilted lining. It's somewhat similar to one we have in the drawer over there. And you can see there's just a hint of it peeking out here. For those of you watching on Facebook, you may not be able to see all the details on this, but the stripes, the alternating stripes, are beautiful velvet and silk that alternate, and then we have this gorgeous quilted satin lining. This particular jacket was used on a honeymoon trip to Europe and worn by Mary Horbach Burke. And she and her husband, John Burke, went on their honeymoon in 1883 to Europe and were there for 6 months. And according to family history, they bought this in Paris. It doesn't have any labels or markings inside, but it's absolutely beautiful. Okay, so I think we're now going to move down the gallery a little bit. And I'm going to move down the wall, so you're welcome to stay seated or come closer if you'd like to move with me down the gallery. The next quilt we're going to talk about is this beautiful log cabin quilt. That's a very heavy wool quilt. And if you look around the edges of the quilt, you can get a hint of what the backing is like. So we'll take a peek here. And you can see it's a striped heavy wool backing. It would have been quite the warm quilt. And here you can just see hints of that around the edge. So what the quilter did is she took the backing and folded that around to the front of the quilt to form the binding. And it provides like a really cute little detail along the edge of the quilt. So that was sometimes done with backings, is moving that, curving that backing over to the front of the quilt to form the binding. Okay, and then if we go down to the next one, you're going to follow our horseshoes. This quilt has all sorts of great information provided on the labels. So one of the things I wanted to talk about was all the great provenance you can learn about quilts from their backings. And oftentimes a quilter added information, or perhaps the family had it registered as part of the quilt project later. And this quilt is very rich in history because it's had several different registries and information from the quilt maker and their family. So this label here says, History of the Lynne quilt. Note given with quilt on a large index card type. The quilt is red and white colors. James Richard Lynne. Great-grandmother Lynne pieced this quilt in 1889 and told me to give it to my first grandson. I quilted it in 1889. Its name is Rob Peter to pay Paul. Cut out red and sew into white, cut out white and sew into red. Your grandmother, Mary L. Lynne. So someone in the family later typed all that information that they were given on a card and attached it to the quilt. And one of the reasons I really love this one is we know, sometimes you don't know who added that information to the quilt, but in this case we do. So we know that the great-grandmother provided this information and then it was later added to the quilt. You can see there's two more labels though, and one is from the International Quilt Study Center. Our friends over there do quilt ID days occasionally, and so that's a great way for people to document their family quilts. And so they've listed out the pattern name, the makers, who it was made for, where it was made, and then that it was identified in 2007 at one of their ID days. And then the other label is for the Nebraska Quilt Project, and you'll see a registry number there, and that it was registered in 1988. Some of you may be very familiar with that project. Across the state, the Nebraska Quilt Project registered about 5,000 quilts in the state and assigned numbers to each one, and that documentation was then put into archives several different places here in Lincoln, including the university. Our History Nebraska archives has copies of those records as well. And then you can also find a lot of those records online through the Quilt Index. So that's a really great resource for Nebraska information as well. So this quilt is very well documented. We're very lucky to have it in our collection. Okay, we're going to go this way now and just talk for a minute about yo-yo quilts. So this is a yo-yo quilt, and these are some yo-yos we've made to decorate the area of the yo-yo quilt. We have a few down here for people to handle as well. And one of the things that's really interesting about yo-yo quilts is how they're constructed. And you can see there's a lot of texture, and basically each round is gathered in the center. But you don't really get a sense of that just seeing the front of the quilt. You might wonder, what's on the back? How did they make that? So one of our solutions for the yo-yo quilts was to make some giant ones that people could handle and look at and kind of think about, oh, how did they make that? We've put some cardboard in the center just to make them a little more sturdy and less floppy. But you can see on this quilt, the back is a much smoother texture. And as I was talking to a colleague not too long ago, she said, well, what's really the front and the back of this quilt? Which side do you like better? So I think that's an interesting question. Some people may love the texture and the gathering on this side. Others who like maybe a more clean line would say, I really like the back. So I think that's an interesting question we can all explore. Some quilts, it may not be as obvious which side, what is up, what is down, what is back, what is front, especially with whole cloth quilts. I think we're probably getting pretty close on our time for today. So I'm happy to take any questions you have, and then if you want to spend more time, we can certainly go around and look at more of the quilts that are hanging.